The morning mist still clung to Central Park's pathways when Madison Harper emerged from the subway with her arms full of wildflowers. Dawn was her sanctuary, the only time Manhattan belonged to people like her before the city transformed into a playground for those who could afford its luxuries. She moved through the shadows of towering buildings, her weathered canvas bag bouncing against her hip with each determined step. At 28, Madison had mastered the art of invisibility. She knew which corners offered the best foot traffic without attracting security guards, which subway entrances provided shelter during sudden downpours, and exactly how to arrange her modest bouquets to catch the eye of hurried commuters searching for a moment of beauty in their concrete jungle. Fresh flowers. "Brighten your morning," she called softly near the entrance to the Plaza Hotel, her voice carrying just enough confidence to sound professional without seeming desperate. The irony wasn't lost on her, selling nature's simplest gifts outside one of the city's most extravagant establishments. 3 years had passed since her father's construction company collapsed, taking with it their family home in Queens and her dreams of finishing her art degree at NYU. The mountain of debt he'd left behind still haunted her mailbox, but Madison had learned to carry dignity like armor. She didn't ask for handouts. She didn't explain her circumstances to curious customers. She simply offered beauty and accepted payment with a grateful smile. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across Fifth Avenue as Madison arranged her remaining bouquets on a small cloth near the park's edge. She'd learned to read the rhythm of the city, the early joggers who occasionally stopped for a single stem, the business executives who bought larger arrangements for their assistants, the tourists who photographed her display more often than they purchased from it. "Excuse me, miss." Madison looked up to find a security guard approaching, his expression apologetic but firm. She recognized him. David from the Plaza's morning shift, a kind man in his 50s who always tried to give her a few minutes of warning before asking her to move along. "You know I can't let you stay here much longer," he said quietly, glancing toward the hotel's gleaming entrance. "Management's been asking questions." "Of course," Madison replied, already beginning to pack her flowers back into the cloth. "Thank you for the time, David." As she gathered her belongings, a sleek black town car glided to a stop in front of the hotel, the kind of vehicle that whispered money rather than shouting it, with tinted windows that reflected the morning light like dark mirrors. Madison had seen hundreds of such cars over the years, each one representing a world as foreign to her as the surface of Mars. But something made her pause. Perhaps it was the way the driver stepped out with military precision, or how he moved to open the rear door with practiced deference. Or maybe it was simply the timing, the way her mundane morning routine suddenly felt charged with possibility. The passenger who emerged was nothing like what Madison expected. She'd grown accustomed to the city's wealthy elite, older men in shul, expensive suits who treated their money like a shield, women draped in designer labels who looked through service workers as if they were transparent. This man was different. He was tall, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair and the kind of composed presence that suggested he was used to command. His suit was impeccably tailored but understated, his movements economical and purposeful. But it was his eyes that caught Madison's attention, dark, intelligent, and currently surveying the street with the focused attention of someone who noticed everything. Those eyes found hers. The moment stretched between them like a held breath. Madison felt suddenly conscious of her simple jeans and worn sweater, the smudges of pollen on her fingers, the way her auburn hair had escaped its ponytail during her morning preparations. But she didn't look away. Something in his gaze suggested he was seeing her, really seeing her, in a way that felt both thrilling and unsettling. "Sir?" David's voice cut through the moment as he approached the newcomer. "I'm sorry, but we're dealing with an unauthorized vendor situation. Nothing to concern yourself with." The stranger's attention shifted to the security guard, then back to Madison, who was now standing with her bag of flowers clutched against her chest. She expected him to nod dismissively and disappear into the hotel's opulent lobby like every other wealthy guest she'd encountered. Instead, he walked toward her. "What kind of flowers are those?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't quite place. something that hinted at expensive education and international sophistication. Madison blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "Wild daisies, baby's breath, and some early cherry blossoms I found in the park," she replied honestly. "Nothing fancy, but they're fresh." He studied the modest arrangement she held, his expression unreadable. "They're beautiful," he said simply. "How much?" $15 for this bouquet, Madison answered, her voice steadier than she felt. She'd learned not to apologize for her prices, even when selling to people who probably spent more on a single cup of coffee. Without hesitation, he reached into his jacket and produced a crisp $20 bill. "Keep the change," he said, accepting the flowers from her hands. For a moment, their fingers brushed, and Madison felt an unexpected jolt of electricity at the contact. "Thank you," she managed, watching as he inhaled the delicate fragrance of the wildflowers with genuine appreciation. "No," he replied, meeting her eyes once more. "Thank you." And then he was gone, disappearing through the plaza's revolving doors with her simple bouquet in his hands, leaving Madison standing on the sidewalk with questions she couldn't answer and a flutter in her chest she couldn't explain. David approached again, his expression kind but insistent. "Madison, you really need to move along now." She nodded absently, mechanically packing the rest of her flowers while her mind replayed the strange encounter. In 3 years of selling flowers on the streets of Manhattan, she'd served hundreds of customers. Most were forgettable faces in an endless stream of humanity. Very few were regulars who'd earned her genuine affection through consistent kindness. But this man was different. There had been something in the way he'd looked at her flowers, not as a convenient purchase or a charitable gesture, but as if he understood their true value. As if he recognized that she wasn't just selling stems and petals, but offering moments of grace in a harsh city. As Madison made her way toward her next location near Grand Central Terminal, she couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with the mysterious stranger was more than a random transaction. Something about the intensity of his attention, the care with which he'd handled her simple bouquet, suggested a depth she hadn't expected from someone emerging from a luxury hotel at 8 in the morning. She spent the rest of the day moving through her familiar circuit, the subway entrance near Rockefeller Center, the small plaza behind the New York Public Library, the corner near Union Square where office workers grabbed lunch. But even as she arranged and rearranged her flowers, smiled at customers and counted her modest earnings, part of her attention remained focused on that moment of connection outside the Plaza Hotel. By evening, as Madison climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her tiny studio apartment in Astoria, she'd almost convinced herself that the encounter had been perfectly ordinary. Just another customer, albeit one with better manners than most. But when she opened her phone to check her messages, she found something that stopped her cold. A notification from the Plaza Hotel's Instagram account had tagged a photo. With trembling fingers, she opened the image and found her wildflower, bouquet arranged in an elegant crystal vase, photographed with professional lighting against the backdrop of what appeared to be a luxurious suite. The caption was simple. "Sometimes the most beautiful things are found in unexpected places." The post had already garnered hundreds of likes and dozens of comments, but Madison barely noticed the social media engagement. What captured her attention was the subtle signature in the corner of the image, not the hotel's usual marketing watermark, but something personal, a single initial, C. As she stared at the photograph, Madison realized that her ordinary morning had been anything but ordinary for him as well. Someone had taken the time to create art from her simple flowers, to transform her humble offering into something worthy of digital immortality. The gesture felt both generous and mysterious, like receiving an unsigned love letter. She set her phone aside and moved to her small window, looking out at the lights of Manhattan flickering to life across the East River. Somewhere in that glittering expanse was the man who'd bought her flowers and turned them into something beautiful. Someone who'd seen value in what she offered and found a way to honor it. For the first time in months, Madison fell asleep thinking about possibility rather than mere survival. Christopher Ashford stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office overlooking Central Park, the morning light casting sharp angles across his tailored suit. In his hand, he held a tablet displaying architectural plans for the newest addition to his family's hotel empire, a luxury resort in the Hamptons that would cater to Manhattan's elite-seeking weekend escapes. At 32, Christopher had inherited more than just wealth from the Ashford dynasty. He'd inherited expectations, responsibilities, and a carefully orchestrated life that left little room for spontaneity. Every decision was filtered through boards of directors, legal teams, and family advisors who viewed emotions as liabilities and personal connections as potential security risks. The wildflower bouquet from 3 days ago sat in a place of honor on his desk, now dried but still beautiful in its simplicity. His assistant, Margaret, had questioned its presence among the more formal floral arrangements that typically graced his office, elaborate orchids and exotic blooms that cost more than most people spent on groceries. "Sir?" Margaret's voice came through the intercom. "Your 10 o'clock appointment is here." Christopher glanced at his schedule, frowning slightly. He didn't recall scheduling anything for this time slot. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but I don't see—" "It's Miss Emily Ashford, sir. She says it's family business." Christopher's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His younger sister had a talent for appearing at the most inconvenient moments, usually when she'd made decisions that contradicted their family's carefully maintained image. "Send her in." Emily swept into the office like a force of nature, her designer jeans and cashmere sweater a deliberate contrast to the formal business attire worn by everyone else in the building. At 26, she possessed the same dark eyes as her brother, but where his gaze was controlled and calculating, hers sparked with rebellion and mischief. "Before you say anything," she began, settling into the chair across from his desk without invitation, "I want you to know that I've already made my decision and I'm not here for permission." "Of course you're not," Christopher replied dryly, setting down his tablet and giving her his full attention. "What catastrophe am I managing today?" Emily grinned, unperturbed by his sarcasm. "I'm opening an art gallery in Soho, independent. Artists, emerging talent, people who create because they have something to say rather than because it matches someone's investment portfolio." Christopher was quiet for a long moment, studying his sister's face. Emily had always been the family rebel, the one who questioned traditions and challenged expectations. While he'd been groomed to run the business empire, she'd been given more freedom to pursue her interests, a freedom she'd consistently used to push boundaries. "The board will have opinions," he said finally. "The board can share their opinions at their weekly dinner parties," Emily shot back. "I'm not asking for family money, Christopher. I have my own inheritance and I've been planning this for 2 years. I'm here because I want you to understand why this matters to me." She leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "Do you remember when we were kids and you used to sneak me into Dad's office after hours? You'd let me arrange the flowers from his meetings because I said they looked sad in their fancy vases." Christopher's expression softened slightly at the memory. "You always insisted on mixing the expensive orchids with wildflowers from the courtyard. Because beauty shouldn't be exclusive," Emily said quietly. "Because sometimes the most meaningful things grow in unexpected places." She paused, her eyes shifting to the dried bouquet on his desk. "Speaking of which, that's new." Christopher followed her gaze, his jaw tightening again. "It's nothing significant." "Right," Emily drawled, standing up to examine the arrangement more closely. "This is definitely nothing significant. These are wildflowers, Christopher. Daisies and baby's breath. The kind of arrangement that costs $15 from a street vendor, not $300 from our usual florist." "Your point being?" Emily turned back to him with a knowing smile. "My point being that my stoic, controlled, never does anything without a business plan brother has a bouquet of street flowers on his desk that he's been staring at for the past 10 minutes. Before Christopher could formulate a response, Margaret's voice came through the intercom again. "Mr. Ashford, there's a Madison Harper here to see you. She says you know her, but she doesn't have an appointment." Christopher's entire body went still. Emily's eyes widened with interest as she watched her brother's carefully controlled expression falter for just a moment. "Send her up, Christopher." said quietly. "Well, this just got interesting," Emily murmured, settling back into her chair with obvious delight. "Should I leave?" "Stay," Christopher said, surprising himself with the word. Perhaps having Emily there would help him maintain his composure. 5 minutes later, Margaret ushered Madison into the office, and Christopher felt the same jolt of recognition he'd experienced 3 days earlier. Today, she wore a simple green dress that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, her auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun that revealed the graceful line of her neck. She carried herself with quiet dignity, but he could see the uncertainty in the way she clutched her small purse. "Ms. Harper," Christopher said, standing as she entered. "Thank you for coming." Madison's eyes swept the luxurious office, taking in the panoramic view of Central Park, the polished mahogany furniture, and the array of expensive art on the walls. When her gaze landed on the dried flowers on his desk, a small smile touched her lips. "I'm sorry to bother you," she began, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "I'm not sure why you asked me to come, Mr. Ashford," Christopher supplied. "Christopher Ashford, and this is my sister, Emily." Emily stood and extended her hand with genuine warmth. "The mysterious flower lady," she said with a grin. "I've heard absolutely nothing about you, which in my family means you're either very important or very dangerous." Madison shook Emily's hand, looking confused but charmed by the younger woman's directness. "I'm neither, I'm afraid. I just sell flowers." "Just sell flowers," Emily repeated, glancing meaningfully at her brother. "How wonderfully refreshing." Christopher cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. "Miss Harper, I asked you here because I have a business proposition. Your flowers were impressive. I'd like to discuss the possibility of you providing arrangements for some of our events." Madison blinked, clearly not having expected anything like this. "Your events?" "The Ashford Group owns several hotels in Manhattan," Christopher explained, his tone becoming more formal as he slipped into business mode. "We host numerous corporate events, private parties, and social gatherings that require floral arrangements. Your work has a unique aesthetic that might appeal to certain clients." "You want to hire me based on one bouquet of wildflowers?" Madison asked, skepticism creeping into her voice. Emily leaned forward with interest. "This is fascinating. Christopher, you usually require 3 references, a portfolio review, and a background check before hiring someone to clean the windows. But you're offering this woman a contract based on flowers you bought on the street." Christopher shot his sister a warning look before turning back to Madison. "I believe in recognizing talent when I see it. Your arrangements have an authenticity that's rare in this city. I'd like to give you an opportunity to showcase that talent on a larger scale." Madison was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "What kind of events are we talking about?" "Corporate dinners, charity galas, private receptions," Christopher replied. "Nothing too elaborate initially. I'd want to see how you handle smaller projects before considering anything more significant." "And the pay?" Christopher named a figure that made Madison's eyes widen. It was more than she made in 3 months of selling flowers on the street. "There would be conditions," he continued, watching her reaction carefully. "You'd need to work within our aesthetic guidelines, coordinate with our event planners, and maintain our standards of professionalism." Madison straightened, her expression growing cooler. "Mr. Ashford, I appreciate the offer, but I need to be clear about something. I don't sell beauty without truth. If you're looking for someone to create arrangements that look expensive, rather than meaningful, you should find someone else." Emily clapped her hands together with delight. "Oh, I like her." Christopher found himself strangely moved by Madison's response. In his world, most people agreed to terms without question, motivated primarily by money and access to his family's influence. Madison's conditions suggested she valued something more precious than profit. "What would truth look like in this context?" he asked quietly. Madison met his eyes directly. "It would mean using flowers that tell a story, not just ones that match the tablecloth. It would mean arrangements that reflect the purpose of the event, not just its budget. It would mean treating flowers as art, not decoration." "That sounds exactly like what we need," Christopher replied, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Madison studied his face for several moments, as if trying to read his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "I'll consider your offer, Mr. Ashford, but I'll need some time to think about it." "Of course," Christopher said, pulling a business card from his jacket. "My direct number is on there. Call me when you've made your decision." As Madison turned to leave, Emily spoke up. "Miss Harper, what made you decide to sell flowers?" Madison paused at the door, her expression growing distant. "Sometimes when everything else falls apart, beauty is all you have left to offer the world." After she left, Emily turned to her brother with undisguised fascination. "Christopher." "Ashford, what exactly is going on here?" Christopher moved back to his window, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'm offering a talented florist a business opportunity." "Right," Emily said dryly, "and I'm opening an art gallery because I enjoy paperwork. Try again." Christopher was quiet for a long moment, watching the tiny figures moving through Central Park below. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "She sees things differently than most people do. When she looks at those flowers, she sees something I've been missing." "And what's that?" Christopher turned back to his sister, his expression vulnerable in a way she rarely saw. "The possibility that something valuable doesn't have to be expensive, that something beautiful doesn't have to be complicated." Emily smiled, but her eyes were gentle. "Well, big brother, it sounds like you might be learning something important." As Christopher returned to his architectural plans that afternoon, he found his attention wandering to his phone, wondering when Madison would call with her decision. 2 weeks had passed since Madison accepted Christopher's proposition, and their professional relationship had settled into a rhythm of careful politeness, punctuated by moments of unexpected understanding. She'd successfully handled 3 small events: a corporate dinner, a book launch, and a charity luncheon, each time creating arrangements that somehow captured the essence of the occasion in ways that surprised even Christopher. The charity luncheon had been particularly memorable. Instead of the typical roses and lilies that usually graced such events, Madison had created centerpieces featuring native New York wildflowers mixed with herbs from community gardens in the Bronx. The arrangements had told a story about growth and resilience that perfectly complemented the Foundation's mission to support urban youth programs. "The Hartwell Foundation called this morning," Margaret informed Christopher as he reviewed the morning's correspondence. "They specifically requested Ms. Harper for their autumn gala. They said her arrangements spoke to their souls." Christopher looked up from his papers with slight amusement. "Spoke to their souls?" "Mrs. Hartwell's exact words, sir." It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when Margaret's voice came through the intercom with an unusual urgency. "Mr. Ashford, we have a situation with the Charleston weekend retreat. The resort manager just called. There's been a booking error." Christopher frowned, setting aside the contracts he'd been reviewing. The Charleston retreat was a quarterly gathering of the Ashford Group's top investors, a carefully orchestrated weekend designed to strengthen business relationships in an elegant, relaxed setting. Everything was planned months in advance with military precision. What kind of error? The presidential suite was double booked. One reservation is for you and the other is for Ms. Harper. She was scheduled to arrive tomorrow to prepare arrangements for Saturday's dinner, but there are no other available accommodations in the city. Everything's booked due to the music festival. Christopher was quiet for a moment, calculating options. The Charleston Historic District filled up quickly during festival weekends, and finding alternative accommodations on such short notice would be nearly impossible. Canceling Madison's involvement wasn't an option. The investors were specifically expecting her unique touch after word had spread about her previous work. "Sir?" Margaret prompted. "Book Ms. Harper a different room," Christopher decided. "I tried, sir. The resort is completely full and so is everywhere else within 50 miles. The festival has drawn visitors from across the southeast." Christopher drummed his fingers on his desk, considering alternatives. The presidential suite was spacious with separate bedrooms, a living area, and a private terrace overlooking the historic district. It was designed for business entertaining, not intimate encounters. "Sir, there is one option," Margaret continued, hesitantly. The suite has 2 bedrooms. If you're comfortable with the arrangement, you could share the space. Strictly professional, of course. The suggestion hung in the air for several moments. Christopher's first instinct was to find another solution. His life was carefully compartmentalized, and mixing business with personal space violated several of his unspoken rules. But something about the idea of spending time with Madison outside, the formal constraints of their usual interactions, intrigued him more than it should have. "Call Miss Harper," he said finally. "Explain the situation and see if she's comfortable with the arrangement. Make it clear that she's free to decline if she prefers to postpone her involvement." An hour later, Margaret returned with Madison's response. "She said she's willing to make it work, sir. She'll arrive tomorrow afternoon as planned." The flight to Charleston the next day was Christopher's first indication that this weekend would be different from his usual business retreats. Instead of his customary solitude or conversations with investors, he found himself genuinely looking forward to Madison's company. She'd proven to be thoughtful and articulate during their working relationship, with insights that went beyond her floral expertise. Madison arrived at the resort just as the afternoon sun was casting golden light across the historic district's cobblestone streets. Christopher watched from the suite's terrace as her taxi pulled up to the entrance, noting the way she paused to admire the old architecture before collecting her simple luggage. When she knocked on the suite's door 20 minutes later, Christopher opened it to find her looking slightly overwhelmed by the luxury surrounding her. The presidential suite was elegant without being ostentatious, decorated in soft blues and creams that reflected the coastal setting. "This is beautiful," Madison said honestly, setting down her overnight bag and looking around the spacious living area. "I can see why your investors enjoy these retreats." "I'm glad you approve," Christopher replied, gesturing toward the bedrooms. "You can take the master suite. I'll use the smaller room." Madison looked surprised. "That's not necessary. I'm sure the smaller room is perfectly fine for me." "I insist," Christopher said firmly. "You're here to work and you should have the most comfortable accommodations possible." As Madison settled into her room, Christopher found himself paying attention to small details he usually overlooked. The way she carefully hung her simple dresses in the expansive closet, the sound of her moving around the space with quiet efficiency, the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her, probably from the sachets she used to keep her floral supplies fresh. They maintained careful boundaries that first evening, sharing the living area, but keeping their interactions polite and professional. Madison worked on her laptop, finalizing plans for the next day's arrangements, while Christopher reviewed investor presentations. But there was an undercurrent of awareness between them, a recognition that their usual formal dynamic had shifted in this more intimate setting. "Would you like some wine?" Christopher offered as the sun began to set over the harbor. "I have a bottle of something local that the concierge recommended." Madison looked up from her laptop, hesitating for a moment before nodding. "That sounds nice." They moved to the terrace with their glasses, the warm Charleston evening wrapping around them like silk, the historic district spread below them. In a tapestry of gaslights and ancient trees, the distant sound of music from the festival creating an atmospheric backdrop. "It's beautiful here," Madison said softly, leaning against the terrace railing. "There's something about old cities that feels honest, like they've seen enough to stop pretending." Christopher studied her profile in the golden light, struck by her ability to find meaning in unexpected places. "Is that why you like working with flowers?" "Because they're honest." Madison turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "Flowers don't lie. They bloom when they're ready, wilt when their time is over, and create beauty without apology. There's something pure about that." "And what about people?" Christopher asked quietly. "Do you think we're capable of that kind of honesty?" Madison met his eyes directly, and Christopher felt that familiar jolt of connection. "I think most people have forgotten how. We're so busy trying to be what others expect that we lose track of who we actually are." The conversation continued as the evening deepened, moving from professional topics to more personal ones with a naturalness that surprised them both. Christopher found himself sharing stories about growing up in the shadow of family expectations, while Madison spoke about the challenges of rebuilding her life after her father's business collapse. "I used to be angry about it," Madison admitted, swirling the wine in her glass. "Losing the house, dropping out of school, watching everything we'd worked for disappear. But selling flowers taught me something unexpected." "What's that?" "That sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what truly matters." Christopher was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. In his world, loss was avoided at all costs, protected against by lawyers and insurance policies, and carefully managed investments. The idea of embracing loss as a path to discovery was both foreign and strangely appealing. "I've never lost anything significant," he admitted. "Everything in my life has been carefully planned and protected. Sometimes I wonder what I'd discover if I didn't have all those safeguards." Madison smiled softly. "Maybe that's why you bought my flowers that first morning. You recognized something you'd been missing." As the night air grew cooler, they moved back inside, but the intimacy of their conversation continued. Christopher found himself studying Madison's face in the soft lamplight, noticing the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the graceful movement of her hands as she spoke, the unexpected depth of her observations about art, life, and human nature. "I should let you get some rest," Christopher said finally, though he was reluctant to end the evening. "Tomorrow we'll be busy with the investor dinner." Madison nodded, rising from the sofa where they'd been sitting. "Thank you for sharing the wine and the conversation. It's been nice to talk about something other than business arrangements." She moved toward her bedroom. She paused at the doorway. "Christopher, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you really offer me this job? And please don't say it was just because of my floral arrangements." Christopher met her gaze steadily, recognizing that this moment called for the kind of honesty they'd been discussing. "Because when I watched you arrange those wildflowers, I saw someone who understood something I'd forgotten. That beauty and meaning don't always come with a price tag." Madison's expression softened. "And what did you remember?" "That some of the most valuable things in life can't be bought or controlled. They have to be discovered." The silence that followed was charged with understanding and possibility. Christopher felt the careful walls he'd built around his emotions beginning to shift, not crumbling but becoming more permeable. "Good night, Christopher," Madison said. Softly, "Good night, Madison." As Christopher prepared for bed in the smaller room, he could hear Madison moving around the suite, and he found the domestic sounds oddly comforting. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about market projections or board meetings or family expectations. Instead, he was thinking about a woman who saw beauty in wildflowers and honesty in adversity, and wondering what might happen if he allowed himself to see the world through her eyes. The investor dinner had been a triumph. Madison's arrangements, featuring native Charleston jasmine intertwined with New York's Queen Anne's lace, had created a visual narrative about bridging distances and finding common ground. The symbolism hadn't been lost on the investors, who'd spent the evening discussing not just profit margins, but the importance of authentic connections in business. Christopher had watched Madison work throughout the day, marveling at her ability to transform simple flowers into storytelling masterpieces. But as the morning light grew stronger, reality began to creep in. Christopher's phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, reminders of meetings and obligations that couldn't be postponed. His carefully ordered life was waiting for him back in Manhattan, along with family expectations and business responsibilities that had no room for complications. Madison stirred beside him, her eyes opening slowly. When she saw him watching her, she smiled with a warmth that made his chest tighten. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," he replied, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," Madison admitted, stretching languidly. Then she seemed to register his expression. "What's wrong?" Christopher hesitated, unsure how to articulate the conflict raging inside him. "We should probably talk about what happens now." Madison's expression grew more guarded. "What do you mean?" "Last night was..." Christopher struggled to find words. That wouldn't diminish what they'd shared. It was incredible, but we both have responsibilities, expectations. My family, the business, your work. Are you saying this was a mistake? Madison asked quietly, sitting up and wrapping the sheet around herself. No, Christopher said quickly. Never that. But it's complicated, Madison. My life isn't entirely my own. There are people who depend on the decisions I make, investors who trust my judgment. If I'm not careful... If you're not careful, what? Madison's voice had grown cooler. Someone might find out you spent the night with a street flower vendor? The words hit Christopher like a physical blow. That's not what I meant, isn't it? Madison stood, gathering her clothes with quiet dignity. I understand, Christopher. You have an image to maintain, a reputation to protect. Last night was beautiful, but it can't follow us back to the real world. Madison, please. But she was already moving toward the bathroom, her spine straight and proud. I'll finish the arrangements for today's brunch, and then I'll head back to New York. We can pretend this never happened. Christopher watched her go, every instinct screaming at him to follow, to explain that he wasn't ashamed of her or what. They'd shared, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, wondering how he'd managed to hurt the first person who'd made him feel truly alive in years. The flight back to New York was a study in polite professionalism. Madison completed her work with her usual excellence, but the easy warmth between them had vanished, replaced by careful courtesy that felt like a wall. Christopher made several attempts to restart their conversation from the previous night, but Madison deflected each one with gracious efficiency. Back in Manhattan, they fell into a new routine. Madison continued handling floral arrangements for Ashford Group events, but their interactions became strictly business. The easy banter and meaningful glances disappeared, replaced by emails and phone calls handled through Margaret. Christopher told himself this was better, more appropriate, but the hollowness in his chest suggested otherwise. 3 weeks after Charleston, Christopher was reviewing quarterly reports when Emily burst into his office without announcement, as was her habit. "You're an idiot," she declared without preamble, settling into her usual chair. "Good afternoon to you too," Christopher replied dryly. "What particular form of idiocy am I guilty of today?" Madison Harper. Christopher's hands stilled on his papers. "What about her?" "I had lunch with her yesterday," Emily continued, studying her brother's face carefully. "She's pregnant, Christopher." The words hit Christopher like a lightning strike. His carefully maintained composure cracked completely, and Emily could see the raw emotion that flashed across his features before he managed to school his expression. "That's..." Christopher cleared his throat, his mind racing. "That's not possible." "Really? Because I'm pretty sure you understand how these things work." Emily's voice was gentler now, recognizing her brother's shock. "She's about 6 weeks along. The timing seems to match your Charleston retreat." Christopher stood abruptly, moving to his window. The city spread below him as it always did, but everything looked different now. Somewhere in that maze of buildings and people was Madison, carrying his child. "Does she want money?" he asked quietly, his business instincts trying to reassert themselves. "Support? I can arrange..." "Stop," Emily interrupted firmly. "Don't you dare reduce this to a transaction. She doesn't want anything from you, Christopher. She wasn't even going to tell you." Christopher turned back to his sister, his expression stricken. "Then why did she tell you?" "Because she needed to tell someone, and apparently I'm the closest. Thing she has to a friend in your world." Emily's voice carried a note of sadness. "She's scared, Christopher, and she's alone. I have to see her." "Do you?" "Because the last time you two were in a room together, you made her feel like something you were ashamed of. Why would this time be different?" The truth of Emily's words cut deep. Christopher sank back into his chair, running his hands through his hair. "I wasn't ashamed of her. I was scared." "Of what?" "Of how much she meant to me," Christopher admitted, quietly. "Of how completely she'd changed everything I thought I wanted from life. I've spent 32 years building walls around my emotions, Emily. Madison walked through them like they were made of paper." Emily's expression softened. And that terrified you? Yes. So you hurt her before she could hurt you. Christopher was quiet for a long moment. I suppose I did. Well, now she's having your baby, and she's determined to do it alone rather than deal with you again. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? Christopher stood again, his decision crystallizing with startling clarity. I'm going to find her, and I'm going to tell her the truth. Which is? That I love her. That I've loved her since that first morning when she told me she doesn't sell beauty without truth, and that I want to spend the rest of my life learning how to be worthy of that honesty. Finding Madison proved more challenging than Christopher had anticipated. She'd stopped working Ashford Group events, and her usual spots around the city seemed abandoned. It was Emily who finally tracked her down through a network of artists and small business owners in Queens. Madison was in a community garden in Astoria, kneeling among rows of vegetables and herbs, her hands gentle as she tended to a patch of wildflowers that seemed wildly out of place among the practical plantings. She looked beautiful in the afternoon sunlight, her pregnancy barely visible but somehow adding to her natural grace. Christopher approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When she looked up and saw him, her expression went carefully neutral. Christopher. Madison. He stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure of himself. Emily told me about the baby. Madison's hands stilled on the flowers, but she didn't look away. And I need to know if it's mine. The question hung between them, and Christopher immediately regretted his phrasing. Madison's expression grew colder. It's yours, she said quietly, but that doesn't mean you have any obligations. I'm perfectly capable of handling this on my own. I don't want you to handle it on your own. Madison stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. What do you want, Christopher? I want to marry you. The words surprised them both. Christopher hadn't planned to propose, hadn't thought beyond the need to find her and make things right, but as soon as he said it, he knew it was true. Madison stared at him for a long moment. Because I'm pregnant. No, Christopher said firmly. Because I love you. Because I should have told you that in Charleston instead of letting fear make me cruel. Because you're the most extraordinary person I've ever met, and I want to spend my life learning how to see the world through your eyes. Madison's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. You hurt me, Christopher. You made me feel like I was something you had to hide from your real life. I know, Christopher said, moving closer, and I will regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm asking for a chance to prove that you're not separate from my real life. You are my real life. Everything else is just noise. Madison wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. This isn't a fairy tale, Christopher. I can't just forgive you because you've realized you want to do the right thing. I'm not asking you to forgive me because it's the right thing, Christopher replied. I'm asking you to forgive me because what we have is worth fighting for, because those few days in Charleston were the most honest I've ever been with another person, and I want to spend the rest of my life being that honest with you. Madison was quiet for a long time, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she spoke. I planted these wildflowers because they reminded me of the arrangements I made for your investor dinner. Jasmine and Queen Anne's lace. Flowers that shouldn't grow together, but somehow create something beautiful when they do. Christopher felt his heart clench with hope and love. Madison, I love you too, she whispered. I have since that first morning when you looked at my flowers like they mattered. But love isn't enough if you're going to keep trying to fit me into a version of your life that doesn't require you to change. Then I'll change, Christopher said without hesitation. Whatever it takes, because a life without you in it isn't a life I want to live. Madison studied his face for another long moment, then slowly extended her hands. In her palms were 2 small packets of seeds. Jasmine and Queen Anne's lace, she said softly. Emily told me about your penthouse garden. Maybe we could plant them together and see what grows. Christopher took the seeds, understanding the gesture's deeper meaning. Together. Madison nodded, a small smile finally breaking through her tears. Together. 6 months later, Christopher stood in the garden they'd created together on his penthouse terrace, watching Madison arrange flowers for their wedding reception. She moved with the same grace he'd first noticed in Central Park, but now there was an additional glow about her, partly from her pregnancy, which was now beautifully visible, and partly from the happiness they'd built together. The wedding had been small, intimate, held in the same community garden where they'd reconciled. Emily had served as maid of honor, crying through the entire ceremony. The guest list had included a mix of Christopher's business associates and Madison's artist friends, proving that different worlds could indeed blend beautifully. The jasmine and Queen Anne's lace are blooming, Madison said, gesturing toward the corner of the garden where their symbolic plants had taken root, alongside dozens of other varieties they'd planted together. Just like you predicted, Christopher replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his hands on her growing belly. Different species that somehow create something extraordinary together. Madison leaned back against his chest, her hands covering his. I never imagined I'd be here, standing in a penthouse garden, married to a man who bought my flowers on the street and somehow changed both our lives. I never imagined I'd find someone who could teach me that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or controlled, Christopher replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. Only discovered and cherished and protected. As the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that would have made Madison's wildflowers proud, Christopher marveled at the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter outside a luxury hotel to a love that had transformed them both, their story proved that sometimes the most beautiful things in life grew not from careful planning, but from the courage to remain open to possibility. The fee baby kicked gently against Madison's ribs, and they both laughed, their hands moving to feel the movement together. Soon they would welcome their child into a world built on honesty, authenticity, and the kind of love that saw beauty in simplicity and found meaning in connection. Christopher looked out at the city, lights beginning to twinkle below, then at his wife's reflection in the terrace windows, and finally at the garden they'd created together, a mixture of elegant orchids and humble wildflowers that somehow created perfect harmony. What are you thinking about? Madison asked softly. Seeds, Christopher replied, smiling, and how sometimes the most extraordinary gardens grow from the smallest beginnings. Madison turned in his arms, her eyes bright with love and laughter. Well then, Mr. Ashford, I'd say we're off to a beautiful start. As they stood together in their garden of unlikely combinations and beautiful possibilities, Christopher knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. Fim de Historia. Dear viewers, we hope Christopher and Madison's story has touched your hearts and reminded you that love often blooms in the most unexpected places. Like the wildflowers that Madison cherished, the most beautiful relationships often grow from simple, authentic moments rather than grand gestures. If this tale of discovering love through honesty and courage resonated with you, we've prepared a special collection of similar heartwarming stories that explore the complexity of modern romance. You can find our playlist by clicking to your left. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that celebrate the transformative power of love. We post new emotional journeys daily, each one exploring different aspects of the human heart. Join our community in the comments below and tell us what moment in Christopher and Madison's story moved you most. We love hearing from you and can't wait to share our next unforgettable tale. It was during the quiet moments between her professional duties that he'd found himself most captivated. The way she'd paused to help an elderly guest find her seat, how she'd complimented the young server on his tie, her genuine delight when the resort's head gardener had shared stories about the property's historic plantings. Now, as the last guests departed and the evening settled into peaceful quiet, Christopher and Madison found themselves alone on the suite's terrace once again. The Charleston night air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of magnolias and the distant sound of jazz, drifting from the historic district below. "You were remarkable tonight," Christopher said quietly, watching Madison as she stood. Sat at the railing, her face lit by the soft glow of the gas lamps below. She'd changed from her professional attire into a simple sundress that moved gently in the evening breeze. "The flowers were the stars," Madison replied with characteristic modesty. "I just helped them tell their story." "No," Christopher said, moving to stand beside her. "You were the star. The way you connected with people, made them feel seen and valued. That's not something that can be taught or bought." Madison turned to face him, and in the soft light, Christopher could see something vulnerable in her expression. "Christopher, what are we doing here?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Christopher had been asking himself the same thing since their first evening together, watching his carefully controlled life begin to shift around this woman who challenged everything he thought he knew about value and meaning. "I don't know," he admitted honestly, "but I know I haven't felt this way about anyone before." Madison's breath caught slightly. "This way." Christopher reached out, gently touching her face with his fingertips. "Like I've been sleepwalking through my own life until now, like I've finally found something, someone, worth waking up for." The kiss that followed was inevitable, gentle at first, then deeper as 3 weeks of careful professionalism and growing attraction finally found expression. Christopher felt something fundamental shift inside him, as if Madison's honesty and authenticity were calling forth parts of himself he'd long buried beneath duty and expectation. "Madison," he whispered against her lips, and her name had never sounded more important. They moved inside together, no longer fighting the connection that had been building between them since that first morning outside the Plaza Hotel. What happened next was beautiful and natural, two people finally allowing themselves to be vulnerable with each other, to express feelings that had been growing stronger with each shared conversation and meaningful glance. Christopher woke before dawn, Madison sleeping peacefully beside him. In the grey light filtering through the curtains, he studied her face, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way her auburn hair spread across